Great. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this miserable Monday evening for our first of our series of webinars focusing on supporting our graduates and our soon-to-be graduates on getting those interviews done and getting those elusive first jobs. So the first in our series are focusing on our tips and hints in general for interviews. Can I have the next slide, please, Amelia? So my name is Sarah Jane Ryan and I'm the co-chair of the South East Coast region of the CSP. We are a committee of physiotherapists that are all in the Kent, Surrey and Sussex area. I'm joined tonight by Vina and Pilar, who are two other committee members, and Claire, Amelia and Iona from the CSP. And we're also really lucky to be joined by Steve, who is a local manager. This is, as I said, the first in the series in these webinars to be able to help you to develop into that first role. And the CSP is working really hard in supporting you always, and also in terms of getting that first role. So we will talk a little bit about the graduate support package later. And it's really important to kind of think about how you can utilise that for yourself kind of moving forward. We will be offering opportunities for you to ask questions during the session, and Steve and Pilar have very much kind of broken up this for you to be able to kind of engage with them through the session. But because we're such a big group, we're going to ask you to put your questions into the Q&A and we'll manage those questions during the session for you. And afterwards, we can follow up as well with any information we want to give you afterwards. At the end of the webinar, we'll also mention how you can access the wellbeing support and also what the CSP has on offer and some wider ideas that we have for you as well to kind of keep you going whilst you're working on getting your first role. Thank you, Amelia. Next slide, please. So I'm going to hand over now to Steve and Pilar, who are going to introduce themselves and also spend the next hour with you talking about getting those hints and tips around interviews. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah Jane. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Pilar Bustamante. I work as a physiotherapy professional lead at Kent Community Health NHS Foundation Trust, and I'm also a learning disabilities physio by background.
Hi there, I'm Steve Daly. I'm MSK Operations Manager at Horder Healthcare. We're a outpatient physio provider in East Sussex and one of the largest orthopaedic hospitals in Europe, actually. And I also work as an advanced practitioner.
Next slide, Amelia.
Next slide, yeah.
Okay, so we've got a few questions for you guys that you can answer on Mentimeter. So you can see the QR code on the screen, but you can also go on menti.com and enter in the code on the screen. Amelia, should we move on into the next slide?
Yeah.
Because we've got about brilliant.
Yeah,
Thank
I'll
you.
move along now. Oh, sorry. Let me just.
So hopefully everyone can see the question on the screen and on your Menti as well. Brilliant. What about interview questions? Pointers for applications, which is great because we will cover that. How to stand out. Interview process, preparation. How to structure answers, brilliant, because we're definitely covering that. Excellent. CV tip.
Shall I move on to the next one,
Yes,
Pilar?
thank you, Amelia.
Pilar, before you go on, can I just mention to Catherine, who has her hand up, Catherine, we have not got that function tonight. So if you'd like to pop in the Q&A section any questions you have, we'll be able to ask Pilar and Steve as we go along. That's the same for all of you tonight, if you can pop it in the question. Thank you, Rowan, for already putting in question in there. We will get to that through the session.
Sorry, Catherine, you've written that you are struggling with no sound at all. I think we can hear each other. It's possible the connection at your end isn't great. Do you want to sign off and sign back on? Thank you.
Okay, so we wanted to, and we will ask you this question at the end of the session as well, about your confidence in the current application process for new roles. We really hope, and we've designed the presentation with the overall aim to increase your confidence in engaging with employers, preparing your application, trying to identify areas that you can excel through the shortlisting process, and also the skills that will make you feel more confident at the interview stage and then post-interview as well.
I'll move on to the next one, shall I? I think there's just one more Menti question.
Thank you, Amelia. Thank you guys for sharing the level of support that you've accessed so far. It's interesting that some of you are not aware of what support is available, so we will share some of that information as part of this presentation. But also lots of you have access to CSP and also your university via careers advice and personal tutors. So that seems quite helpful. Also, it's nice to see that some of you are relying on peers and friends and also at placement. It's really encouraging to hear that. Okay, shall we move on to the first section, Amelia? Brilliant. So we won't spend too long in terms of searching for roles, but I did notice a question in the Q&A about pointers for job search engines for the private sector. So I've just put a couple of examples of different websites, and I'm more than happy to add those to the Q&A later. So I actually went online last week just to look for jobs, try to sort of recreate where would I go if I was looking for a physio job. So the pictures that you see on the screen, the first one is from NHS Jobs, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. And you can, the search functionality is not the most sensitive, I must say, because sometimes even if you put physiotherapists, it turns out clinical psychologist roles, which I found quite interesting. But you can narrow down your search in terms of location as well, which is quite helpful. The second one I'm sure you all recognize is the physiotherapy jobs page from the CSP. And this gets updated regularly. Also, when you get your CSP news on your mailbox, they will always have a section at the end for jobs. At the bottom of the screen, you can see just physio, and that is a good search engine for the private sector. The other way, perhaps for those of you who haven't graduated yet, is starting those conversations while you're at placement. So as I said earlier, I work in the NHS, and I took a screenshot from our internal, from our intranet, which is called Flow in Kent Community. And actually we have systems in place so we can fast track students into our teams while they're still on placement. So when you are at placement next, have a conversation with your educator. Do you have any fast track systems in place? What happens if there's a job opening while I'm on placement with you? Obviously, there's a time sensitivity element to this, because if, let's say, if you're on your last year and you're not quite on your last placement, they may not be able to hold a role for you. But I think it all starts with a conversation. So feel reassured, hopefully, that there are organizations, NHS trusts out there who already have systems in place to interview and offer roles to a student while they're on placement, and that role will be held until they have the registration, even with the opportunity sometimes, particularly in my trust, for that student to graduate and then start working with us in an unregistered role, such as a band 3 or a band 4, until their ATPC registration comes through. Now, should we check the Q&A if there's any other questions about searching for roles? Because then if not, we can move on straight to Steve.
You can move on, Pilar.
Thank you, Vina. Next slide then, Amelia, and I'll pass you out to Steve.
Thanks, Pilar. The other thing I was going to mention along those lines was also locum agencies will often have listings where they will be in contact with various employers around the place, and employers may come to them to ask for any appropriate candidates to be put forward. So that can be another useful place to find jobs in the private sector. So applying for a job, I guess the first thing for anybody to know is about the employer themselves. So is it a place where you want to work? Is it and do what they do? Is that what you're interested in? And so getting to know the employer themselves, searching through their websites, looking for any publications they may have done, looking for any contracts that they hold, so you get some more background around the sorts of services they provide to and the areas they provide in. Is it an area you want to live in? In particular, most people are recruiting to values within their company. So often you have to dig a bit to find those, and it will be often in the About Us section at the bottom of a page. And buried within that will be mission statements and values that the company or organisation will want to work to. And often early on in the interview process, they will be asking a question which might be veiled in such a way as that's what they're actually looking for, is you to mention that you've done some digging and you found out what their values are, and that you also ascribe to those values. In knowing the employer, you can also, you may have done a student placement there, so that's a really valuable resource, your own experiences of working there. Some of your colleagues or friends from university may have also done that, so don't be scared to ask around. And this sort of goes on to the next slide a little bit as well, but don't be scared to name drop as well when you're applying for the job. I know that when we're doing employment runs, if you name a person that is working here already, you both get an employment bonus if they stay for longer than 6 months. So they'll give each other a Brucey bonus for being a good employee and staying. Other places that other things that are important. So after knowing the employer and thinking of how you might fit in with them, the application and personal statement, doing the process of that. There was a thing came up how to stand out on the word picture before. Usually, I used to work in a big London NHS trust, and we would sometimes get 300 applications for a band 5 job. So it was really important to be able to stand out, and the way the ways that we used to look for is that the application itself was quite punchy in terms of word count. You want to get your point across in 1,000 words. If it was 5 or 6 pages long, no one's going to have time to read that. And it might say all the right things, but in far too many words. So you want to try and keep it as concise and get the point across. One of the key things that can be useful to look into is in the job itself. The job description is about what you'll be doing day to day, and the person specification is you. So that's the person they're looking for. So you need to, it's really useful, and I used to do it as an employer doing interviews, go through the person specification and put an A for application next to each line, or an I for interview, or both, because there'll be the types of things that you need to mention in your application, and then think of scenarios where you might have experienced that, or in any aspect of your life, whether it's in your time as a student, in the role that you're applying for, or as you've been traveling through university, or if you're a mature age student, life experience. If you're not a mature age student, life experience. You might have been a team captain, or in an area of increased responsibility, or volunteered somewhere, or anything that you can draw on that's going to give you a little bit of an edge that meets with some of those elements of the person specification, so that you can mention those in your statement, in your personal statement, and allow yourself to stand out and be more obvious. It's often useful to have a CV, and often you can attach those as well, so you can have a personal statement and a CV. Make sure the personal statement is directed to that employee, to that company. There's nothing more annoying than reading a personal statement that says, and you're applying for an MSK job, and it says, I love working with children, and they don't do kill children. So, it means that you haven't done the research, and you haven't bothered to personalize it to that employer. The other thing that might sound a bit harsh, but make sure the spelling's all correct and the grammar's good. It's easy to just copy and paste your application into a Word document, run it through an editor, and check that the grammar and punctuation and the spelling is all correct. It just shows that you've gone to that little bit of extra effort. As I said earlier, if you've got 300 applications you've got to get through, and you can easily see like someone hasn't bothered to do that, it's an easy one to exclude on the shortlisting criteria. The other thing that is useful to know about from the employer's side is we'll have a shortlisting form with all the applications listed, or applicants listed down it, and there'll be up to 8 criteria that you might score against. So have a think about what the employer might put in their score sheet that they're looking for, and that you can then gear your application and your personal statement towards that. I see Pilar's just put her hand up. You want to chip in on something there?
Yes, thank you, Steve. You were mentioning about person specification. So I think for the NHS, it's good to know that the actual list that you see on the job advert, the person specification, is the shortlisting criteria. So top tip when applying to an NHS role is that you already have that information. You know exactly what is the criteria that the employer will be going through to make the decision whether that application is shortlisted or not. And that is the person spec, and is presented normally against knowledge, skills, qualifications, and you can see it very obviously in all of the job adverts for the NHS. And the idea is that your personal statement reflects that person specification, because that is the way that you will get shortlisted. And the other thing I wanted to add is I think I saw a question on the Q&A about the difference between writing a personal statement for the private sector versus for the NHS. Actually, it's not a bad idea to use the NHS structure as part of your personal statement. Even if you're applying for a different provider, even if it's the private sector, it doesn't really matter, but the NHS application form is quite detailed, and then you can start making it as brief as you need to. And my other final top tip when applying for roles is utilizing the employment history section of your application to reflect the placements that you have completed. In the past, when I've been supporting recruiting managers, normally there's very little detail from applicants about their placements, or they add it to their personal statement, which means that you run out of words in your personal statement to say what's unique about you and how do you stand out compared to other candidates and how you meet the shortlisting criteria. So you can use the employment history to detail each of the placements you have completed. It will say which organization, it will say the time that you spend there. So don't feel too constrained just because it says employment history not to include your placements. It's a really good place, and then you're not eating up the words of your personal statement describing what placements you have accessed. Thank you.
Thanks, Pilar. I've seen that this section and the next section actually overlap quite a lot. So, because the next bit's around shortlisting. So, there's a couple of questions I saw flash up. So, Ryan, you've asked, would you expect employers to look at your written application alongside the interview in the NHS, or should you assume the interview will need to stand alone once you get to that stage? So, I haven't worked in the NHS for about 11 years now, but what we've had to occasionally do, where people have come out of an interview and we can't split them, we have had to go back to their personal statement as well to try and differentiate them somehow. That, you know, it all counts towards the end result. Pilar.
There's also a degree of subjectivity in all of this, of course, but you also have to understand who has had sight of your application before you get to interview. So normally the shortlisting is only done by 1 or 2 people. Those people may or may not be at your interview. Good practice is that at least one of the shortlisters is at the interview. Does that make sense? But then we will call on other colleagues, normally someone who works in the service, someone who would end up being your line manager, or at least managing an element of the service that you'll be working at. So at the point of interview, some of the panel would have seen your supporting statement and your application, and they shortlisted you, and some of the interviewers may have not seen your personal statement or your application. Good practice is that all interviewers have sight. So for example, our recruitment team, the day before an interview, when we have the shortlisted candidates, they will send us all of the applications that will be interviewed that day. So as Steve mentioned, normally when 2 candidates are performing really similarly, you would then rely back on the application to see if there was anything that wasn't mentioned, because again, you don't have all the time in the world in an interview either, and it's about how you can be succinct and impactful. But do not worry, everyone who's interviewing you will have sight either before the interview or after the interview to your application, and they need to correlate, because sometimes you read an application is entirely shortlistable, and for whatever reason that person did not perform at the expectation that you had when you shortlisted them. So ideally we want to see that person shine through at the interview and show you all the things that the application form alone cannot communicate.
Thank you. There's another question. When I say 1,000 words, is that just the supporting statement? Yes. Whole application, there's other bits into it usually. So your work history, as Pilar was just talking about, that could be your student placements in your work history. So yeah, the personal statement or supporting statement would be up to about 1,000 words. Yeah, that's best practice. Let's see more. What's the rest of this saying? I've been rejected from an application for my own trust before the application being too thin. Answered that one already. Do you want to go to the next slide, Amelia? So we've talked a bit about this already with the shortlisting and the person specification. So here's on the screen there is a bit of an example of what it might look like. So typically the first criteria that anybody's going to have on a shortlisting is that you're HCPC registered, or that you've got a degree, or that'll sort of almost be the long listing things. If you don't meet that, or your registration is pending, then it's going to be difficult to get to the next step. I guess the other things to once you have stood out and you've got to the interview, the other thing is possible outcomes of that process, the shortlisting process. So I guess that might be, if you weren't successful, is trying to seek some feedback or what the outcomes might be. So of the interview, so whether it's likely to be a 1 or 2 stage process, or and I've worked at a previous trust was where we did a recruitment day. That was where the process was broken into 3 parts. So this is about preparing for the interview process to come next, to what your expectations might be. The 3 parts were a group exercise where it was next to impossible to triage or prioritise a caseload, but it was looking at the interactions between the group. Then the second bit was a 3-part interview, very quick fire interview, and then the other bit was a written test. But that's a recruitment day. The outcome of that was then that we would generate a long list of people that we might have as candidates that we could offer jobs to when they arose. Being a big London teaching trust, we had 25 Band 5 staff, so no more than that. It was 25 in my team. That was only half of it. So yeah, it was about 50 Band 5s across the trust. So anticipating what the outcomes from that shortlisting and what the next step might be would then lead to your preparation for how what type of interview you might need to prepare for. So yeah, just to recap on that, research the company, make sure that your personal statement meets the criteria that you've established from the person specification, and make sure it's pretty punchy and concise. Would be the sort of takeaways from that. Happy to move. Anything else you want to chip in on that one, Pilar?
Thank you, Steve. I think I was just looking at some of the questions on the Q&A, and I think some of the guys attending today are trying to understand the difference between the statement and the actual application, but I've given some answers already. I think the other thing is, I'm sure some of you in the past, myself, lots of times have experienced an unsuccessful shortlisting, and sometimes due to the volume of applications, organizations are not able to give you individual feedback when you're not shortlisted, and sometimes you just get an email notification that you weren't successful. So because you're not able to get that individual feedback, my top tip would be speak to other peers. If you know that anyone's applying to the organization before, if you know someone who applied to the same role, compare and contrast what were the outcomes, compare and contrast what did they include in their application that made them to get shortlisted, compared to, especially if you were classmates and you attended the same course, then what was it about their application that got them through that initial stage compared to yours, and go back to that person's specification. Have you been explicit enough to demonstrate that you meet that criteria? It could be 9 times out of 10 is that there's a limited amount of shortlisted candidates that can be had for each post, especially if you're only advertising 1 post and let's say you have 50 applications. And sometimes the decision maker, when the applications are quite similar in terms of the person's spec, is who meets the desirable criteria. So pay attention to the desirable criteria, because that may be the decision maker when someone is scoring that application between getting shortlisted or not. And then the second top tip, as I said earlier, expand your sources of feedback, because unfortunately, you won't always be able to get direct individual feedback at the shortlisting stage.
The other thing that used to come up, and I haven't had it for a long time, is candidates actually contacting the recruiting manager and asking some questions. I haven't had that happen for a long time, but I remember when I was in your position actually ringing up the employers and having a chat and seeing if you can arrange to come and visit. It just shows that you're really keen and you want to know more about the job and see if it fits. And then they'll know your name, they'll know your face, and they'll they'll look out for your application if they think that you're you're up to something, that you're good for the job. Certainly that helps, because we get exposure to students on placements and stuff, and you look out for ones that because you've had lunch with them, and you're floating around the department, and you think, oh, they're pretty good. So that can help as well. There was a question there: how much would you say CV contributes to the application process? It's important. And I don't think any part of that CV or personal statement, they're all elements that come into the shortlisting process. So the other thing to make sure within your CV is in your work history, if there's any gaps. So like if you've been traveling, that's really cool, because it actually shows that you've got off your backside and gone and had a look around the world, and you've had life experience. You've had to organize all this stuff. You've got time management skills. You've got the ability to navigate around the world, so, and be independent and plan things. So they're all soft skills that and communication skills, all those things that you can draw on to be able to utilize to not pad out, but make yourself be more attractive. Any other questions?
I've answered some of them. I answered a very similar statement to what you just shared about the weight of the CV. And I've also just answered a question around the main things that should be included in the personal statement. So I think I've summarized what we've shared so far.
Yeah.
It should be anything that is specific to you as an applicant that is not covered in the overall application form, because they tend to be quite prescriptive, employment history, qualifications, training, etc. And then we move on to the personal statement. That's everything about you that you haven't had a chance to say until then, whether you went traveling, whether you've been volunteering, whether you were a class rep, whether you were a CSP rep, etc. But also, most importantly, this is the bit where you say, I am your best candidate because I meet this criteria, this criteria, this criteria from your person spec.
And it actually then also helps with the interview preparation process as well, because you've put the time in to think about what the employer might want of you. So then you can prepare for the interview through that process. A couple other questions. How many candidates typically? It really varies by employer and the size of the employer as well. And yeah, so if it's a small employer, they might only shortlist 2 or 3 people. If it's a huge big trust, they might do the process I talked about earlier, where they do an interview day, and you might have 30 people come in for interview, and they generate from that a short list of 20 that they're going to offer jobs to. Depends on each job, basically. Just reading through some other questions.
I think there is a question around when to start looking for jobs. And it says some people start very early, such as in December, assuming that then you're graduating in the summer. But a lot of them also apply in April, May, or over the summer holiday. So from my experience in the NHS, it's really hard to anticipate the market, which offers will be available. Particularly in the current financial constraints, it's not that we have necessarily recruitment cycles that are every so often. It very much depends on what vacancies come around. And the only sources of vacancies in the NHS right now are resignations. Does that make sense? We cannot create an extra post. So let's say I manage a team of 10 physios. For me to advertise a job or a post, it means that I need to have a vacancy. Someone would have had to leave my team. And sometimes it's really difficult to anticipate when in the year that will be. So I think there's absolutely no harm in putting your applications early, because trust me, for the right candidate, the right employer will hold that offer and will wait for your registration. Now, there are some constraints to certain services, especially if it's a short-term contract, for example, or a fixed-term contract, they may not be able to do that. But for the standard permanent contract sort of job, the right candidate will be offered by the right employer to hold that offer after they've been successful. And that will include waiting for your registration. So hopefully we've answered that, but do add anything else if we haven't.
The only other thing there is actually just to build on the point Pilar just made is that often you can start the job earlier but at a lower banding. So, and they'll get you through all the induction stuff, and there's always loads of e-learning and all that boring stuff that you have to do before you actually start working at the coalface, seeing patients. And often they can get you in to get through that so that you're fit and ready to go as soon as your registration comes through, and then you can get fired at patients as soon as they're as soon as your registration comes through, and you can start working autonomously. That's when the exciting fun stuff starts. But yeah, often we'll get people in working as band 4s to get through their induction process and do that e-learning and that gear beforehand. The question about gaps in employment, yeah, just in your CV. If you've been travelling or doing other things, university, whatever, just yeah. Sometimes the gaps can be really obvious, and you think, oh, what have they been doing? It's probably not so relevant for band 5 jobs, but certainly more senior ones where there's a big employment gap, and you think, oh, what's that about? So,
there's a few more questions, but I'm conscious of the time. I'm just going to answer one now verbally, and then I'll try to reply to the other ones in writing. There's a question: will any employers wait until summer graduation? I and some of my course mates want to start applying, but in the person spec, jobs currently say hold a degree. Yes. Now, that happens. Unfortunately, most of these advert processes are automated now. For example, when I am recruiting or supporting teams to recruit for a band 5, I ask my HR team not to put the holds a degree as a mandatory box, because if you do that on the front end user, you will say, do you have a degree? And you put no, and it says, sorry, you cannot proceed with your application. So what I would do in that case, when you see an application that disables you from applying because you haven't got a degree, you can put yes, and then there's a detail to say third year student to be graduating at this date. You can give them a time scale between, like, expecting registration between July and September, for example. I think in university they will tell you when it's likely that you're going to get your HCPC. So you can still go ahead, just put yes, but be honest and forthcoming that you haven't got an HCPC registration as of yet. Should we move on?
Yeah.
Is that Vina who's got her hand up? I'm not sure.
HCPC typically comes through in August for sometime graduates.
Vina, you should be able to unmute.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say, usually when your results are out, the HCPC pass list is sent by your HEI within 2 weeks of the final exam board. So whenever is your exam board and you've received your final exam board letter, 2 weeks from that, so it's very quick, pretty soon, within 2 weeks from your final exam board.
Thank you, Vina. Okay, we're on our last section now, and we'll talk about interview skills. So I saw in the beginning when you were completing the Menti that some of you wanted top tips in terms of how to structure interviews. Do we have another hand up? I'm not sure if it's an attendee or a member of the core team.
I think it's an attendee. So if you'll be able to put your question in the chat, even if it's just something to do with the webinar, or if you're experiencing any issues with it, just pop it in the Q&A, and Claire or Vina can help answer that, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Amelia. So I'm sure you've heard in the past of the STAR method, but if you haven't, you are getting copies of the slides. So it's a really good way of structuring an answer. So you start with S stands for situation. Then you move on to the task. What was the actual problem? that that situation led to. Then the A is for the actions that you took. And that's really important, because sometimes I've had candidates offering really good answers, but actually they weren't the lead of the story. They were more like a side character. And the outcome was great, but then it's very difficult as an interviewer to determine what was the applicant's role in the positive outcomes. And R stands for the results. I always treat this almost like, I'm sure you're familiar with the peel method when you're writing an assignment, that you make a point, you explain. Now I'm going to feel silly because I've forgotten all of a sudden what it stands for, but I'm sure that you know, and you can look it up. It's a very similar structure in terms of, like, you're saying, this is what happened, this was the problem, I did X, Y, and Z, or I escalated to my educator, or I reported it to so-and-so, and the outcome was the patient was safe, there was a proper planned discharge, the MDT were aware of this, that, and the other. I acquired this skill, which enables me to, next patient that comes in, I will provide a better intervention, etc. So that's a nice acronym to keep in mind. The other bit, and I think people and candidates always get worried about non-clinical versus clinical questions. And I think I saw that at the beginning through the Menti. So in terms of clinical questions, it very much depends on the role that you are applying to and the scope of that role and how varied it is. So if you're applying to a rotational band 5, let's say, in an inpatient setting, then you start thinking, okay, what are the wards? What type? And then you start searching, we talked about know your employer. Is this a tertiary center? Therefore, if it's a tertiary center, they'll have a specialism, right? It may be cancer rehab, it may be orthopedics, it may be a pediatric hospital, it may be Stoke Mandeville, for example, it may be a respiratory center for excellence. So that will already give you a little bit of an idea of what clinical specialisms you need to brush up on. But also remember that if you're applying for a junior physio or a band 5 physio or newly registered, they won't expect you to answer clinical questions like a clinical specialist. What we're looking for is a broad understanding and overview of that clinical area, whether it's broad understanding of, pathology, treatment, medical treatment, physio treatment. We wouldn't give you a very complex clinical case question at the newly registered level. Now, if you're going for a non-tertiary center, for example, as a band 5 rotational, start thinking of the wards in a typical hospital that is not a tertiary center. So you'd have your medical ward, your trauma and orthopedic ward, your pediatrics ward, your neuro ward, ICU, etc. So normally you can narrow it down to quite distinct clinical areas: MSK, respiratory, cardiac. Now, if you apply for a community trust like mine, then you start thinking, what sort of patients are seen in the community? They may not be acutely unwell like you would in an acute hospital, but they're normally people with long-term conditions. Maybe there's a degree of frailty in the case of that we're seeing in the community. When you start knowing your employer, is this a community trust that covers children's therapies? So if I'm doing a rotation in a community trust, maybe I'll be asked questions around MSK, frailty, long-term conditions, children's therapies, MDT working. Those are sort of like very general questions that you can expect. But it's really difficult to give you a structured list of what a clinical question will include, because it will be entirely dependent on the role that you're applying for. Now, the other element to discuss here is about non-clinical questions. Steve mentioned in the beginning about understanding the organization's values that you're applying for. So most of the time, the interview in terms of non-clinical will include value-based question. And these are not trick questions. These are normally scenario questions, or they will ask you about your previous experience. Tell us about a time where you demonstrated being proactive at work or an educational setting. Then the STAR method is a beautiful way of answering that question, because it's about how have you demonstrated excellence or responsiveness or compassion. And then another element of the non-clinical questions may be thinking of the pillars of practice. So we have 4 pillars of practice: clinical, research, leadership, and education. So they may want to ask you a question about what's your experience with research? We wouldn't expect for you to say, I've just completed a PhD. It's completely irrelevant for a newly registered role. But think about, well, I wrote my dissertation utilizing this method or that method. Actually, I had to do a literature review. So I did a thematic analysis. That sort of language we would expect if you're asking a non-clinical question about research, because we're not recruiting for a researcher, but we're trying to recruit a quite holistic physio who has, number one, knowledge of the other pillars of practice and has an element of experience. And if for whatever reason you haven't been exposed or you don't feel very confident in that area, you can absolutely say, you know what? I don't feel as confident in my research pillar compared to my leadership or my education. Can I give you an example about the education pillar? Or can I give you an example about the leadership pillar? I actually did a leadership placement as my last placement and I did this, etc., etc. There is a degree of flexibility. And I think sometimes people get tempted. You don't want to show perhaps things that you don't know, but actually it's really appreciated by your interviewers. And also it demonstrates a degree of flexibility and vulnerability. I may not be great at this, but can I show you something that I'm really good at? And then I have a commitment to learn and improve while I'm on the job. I'm conscious of the time. How are we doing? The other thing is prepare your questions for your interviewers. At the end of every single interview you ever go to, they will ask, have you got any questions for us? So this is your time to shine, and this is your time to demonstrate to your interviewer, one, you've studied that employer. You know what they stand for. You know what services they offer. You know what geographical area they cover. You know what their values are. So that's a really good idea in terms of thinking of your questions for your interviews, because that will vary from interview to interview. Another question that I think everybody asks, but it depends how you ask it, what CPD opportunities are available. But I think that question can land differently depending how you ask, because it's not about what have you got for me. It's actually, look, I feel really confident in my MSK management or my respiratory management, but I've never had a placement in the community. And then you say, are there any CPD activities? How you got a preceptorship program? And if so, what does that look like in practice for someone like me? Would I expect to be paired up with a mentor? Would I be expected to be paired up with someone more senior? How does that relationship work? Will I have protected time to engage in CPD? Etc., etc. But you need to make it about yourself, because that shows to the interviewer that you are insightful and self-aware enough and you're confident communicating what your current learning needs are if you were to be successful in the role. And the last bit about interview skills is setting the scene for feedback. I said earlier that unfortunately for shortlisting, it's very unlikely you will get individual feedback, but you absolutely should get individual feedback if you have been unsuccessful at an interview. And it's important. And I think someone asked a question in the Q&A about what is the current setting and what is the background for this difficulty that newly registered physios are experiencing in finding that first role. Do your homework in terms of that. Claire has shared some resources from the CSP, but if you know that competition is high and that you don't know exactly what the chances are for you to be successful, and it may not be because you've done anything wrong, it simply may be because there was one post and 10 people applying for it, as in interviewing for it, compared to 50, 60, 70 applicants. So bear that in mind, but use this as an opportunity to get structured feedback. So some of the questions for your interviewers could be, I'm conscious about, the demand and capacity around physio recruitment. I will be really keen to get feedback after my interview, regardless of the outcome. Could you tell me how would it work? Will I get a phone call? Will I get an email? Actually, I've got a list of questions for feedback. May I leave this list with you? Because I guarantee you that interviewer will take note of that and they will save those questions. And when it's time for them to communicate the outcome of the interview, whether you've been successful or unsuccessful, they will have that list in mind. And I would be incredibly impressed if someone came to an interview and at the end they said, look, you're my 10th interview, my 5th interview since I graduated. Could you answer these questions for me? once you finish your recruitment process. Steve, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Peter. I was just going to add to that, in the interview, don't be scared to write some stuff down and clarify what the question is. So in that situation bit that Pilar talked about, is like, just if you need to, just clarify the situation. So what you're saying is, and you know, you can read the body language in the interview. If they nod at you, you're on the right track. The other thing that I'd suggest is, often, I know certainly when we do interviews, we break them down into sort of sections. So the first one's a bit of an icebreaker, and is trying to match up the value stuff and a bit of history about them. Why do you want to work here? And then typically we'd then go on to questions around skills and knowledge. So what is it about physio and this job that you need to have to bring? And then usually some clinical scenarios. But within those, it's really important that you're aware of your red flags. So it's really easy to fail someone on safety. If you've got no clue about quarter equina syndrome, or, you know, nasty cancer stuff that you need to know about, it's really easy for them to say, actually, this person's going to be unsafe and it's going to be too much work to bring them up to the right level and get them up to speed. And on the question that you were saying before about pillars of practice and the research practice, often there's a question buried in there around using outcome measures and auditing those. And as an undergraduate, you're normally going to have come across some sort of audit, and that satisfies that pillar of practice in a question. But yeah, that was just the little things I wanted to chip in on that bit in the interview itself. Don't be scared to write it down, clarify the question, and don't talk for too long as well. That can get really boring. I've been in interviews where you're sort of thinking, God, I wish they'd shut up. They've just been going on for too long. And you sort of, you know, if you notice the body language from the interviewer getting a bit fidgety, then you've probably been talking a bit too long. So keep it snappy.
Thank you, Steve. I see a question around more close questionings where the STAR method wouldn't be applicable, i.e. what interests you about this role? So I think that's a really good opportunity to demonstrate you've done your homework in terms of finding out about the employer, i.e. I couldn't help but notice that I'm talking about my organization. I couldn't help but notice online that you actually hold a CQC outstanding rating. I take pride in my work and I really want to work in an excellent organization. I feel that by you being rated outstanding by the CQC, which is the regulator, by the way, of NHS providers and others, of all providers actually, it gives me assurance that this is a good organization where I will be supported, where I'll have opportunities for development, when there'll be career pathways available to me. I am that sort of person. I want to work in an excellent organization. Therefore, this is why I'm interested in the role. That answer will change if the organization you are applying for requires improvement rating, because people still need to work in this organization. So your answer may be, actually, I noticed that you've just come out of special measures, or that you just got a requires improvement rating. I would like to be part of this change. I would like to contribute to your organization improving the CQC rating, or your values really strike me, or the proportion of BAME colleagues that you employ really speak to me. I want to be somewhere I belong, etc., etc. NHS staff surveys. If you Google NHS staff survey, you can see organizations in the NHS rated against the people promise, how well treated staff are, what career progression they have, what are the opportunities for BAME or disabled colleagues. So you can say, I check your NHS staff survey results. Your staff seem really happy. I want to be in a team where I feel that I belong, where I have opportunities. So actually, this is what interests me about the role. And then you can bring it to the specific. So first you start about the organization and you think, look, I am passionate about community rehab. I am passionate about inpatient children therapies. I am passionate about MSK, and your organization or this team has been rated as an excellent team. I've seen your patient feedback, which again is made available on all sites. You've got excellent patient feedback, and this is my area of clinical interest. So I want to work somewhere where I can grow as a professional, but I want to be able to deliver a good service. That matters to me because X, Y, and Z. Hope I've answered that question. How are we doing with time? We're actually running out of time. So we will aim to answer all of your questions in writing after the session. Amelia, let's move on to the next section. Oh,
We're
Vina?
just on the questions. I can see Claire had her
Okay.
hand up, but I don't know if she was going to say the same thing about time or she was going to feed in on a question.
No, I was just going to say thanks so much, Pilar and Stephen. I think we can go on for maybe sort of 2-3 more minutes on the questions. And a question came in a little bit earlier, asking for advice about how to prepare for group interviews. So I wondered if either of you had any advice on that.
Yes, I think you have to be mindful of how you want to portray yourself in that setting and understand that it is a competition technically, but the most important thing will be about collaboration. Nobody sets up group interviews with the intention of being a battle royale, and trying to see who comes at top. That is not the purpose of group interviews. One of the purposes is time effective because you can actually observe a multitude of candidates in one go rather than holding individual interviews. And the other purpose is to see you in action interacting with other humans. Because if you think about the role of a physio, it's very rare that you're going to be working alone. Very rare. You will always have your patient, their networks of care, you'll have your colleagues, your MDT, your manager, etc., etc. So be mindful that yes, you want to demonstrate that you are the best candidate for the role, but don't lose your humanity in the process. Make sure that you demonstrate all those soft skills, all those leadership skills, that you collaborate with people, because normally the tasks given in a group interview are not necessarily about how you are better than someone else. It's how together you come to a solution for a problem.
And the solution's usually impossible, but there isn't one. So it's actually looking at how you interact. So yeah, certainly the way we ran it, there'd be all sorts of things mixed up in a triaging or prioritizing list, that, ranging from care of the elderly things to pediatrics, all on one ward. So it's never going to happen in reality. So it's all about the things that Pilar just said, the interactions between people and looking at how you think, and how you express how you think. So preparing for it, be brave.
Brilliant. Anything else, Vina?
There was one that was upvoted, and that was regarding the closing time of jobs, like multiple jobs closing within a couple of hours of getting posted. Do you have any more insight into sort of a closing of a job and whether that's sort of due to internal hiring or what is happening? That question was upvoted by 4 people.
Thank you, Vina. I am conscious of the time, but it is quite difficult to comment on recruitment practices of other organizations. I can sort of give you my opinion in terms of what is good practice and not great practice. It is true that particularly under these financial constraints, most organizations, when they're trying to recruit internally, they must, in terms for equity and accessibility, make the advert public and external. But some of the shortcuts, when you know that you have an internal candidate who's suitable for the job, and that historically you would have published that only internally, so no one else outside the organization could have seen it. One of the shortcuts is to put a really short timescale for that to be made available online. I am not advocating that that is the best practice, but I guess from the other side, in the NHS, it's very difficult to have approval, there we go, to put an advert out, because the monies are incredibly tight. So people are being creative in trying to get the post that we desperately need fulfilled while meeting all of these criteria that is normally imposed at very high level by organizations.
Often, as well, I often see this with applicants from overseas, have just got the search criteria on the NHS jobs set up, and they'll just pump out an application, and it fills up your inbox, and they might then close it after 200 applications as a random number. And the majority of those will be shortlisted. So oftentimes, if it's a job you're really desperate that you want, it can be worth trying to contact the recruitment manager and saying, look, I really think this job's for me. This is an employer I really want to work for. Will you accept a late application? I notice you've closed it, but the original closing date was meant to be in 2 weeks' time or something. that can be worth a shot if you're really keen.
Yes, I think there have been a couple of queries about should we put our qualifications on our CV. They may or may not be applicable. I would say put everything that's there. I'm sure you agree, and you can then discuss it. Someone has put if they wanted to do 2 roles, research and teaching, you can be honest and you can sort of job share. And that's the best way forward, because as opportunities arise, you might be given those from their workplace. You asked about university degrees, whether a 2-1, whether that's looked at. And I think, again, it depends on how you present yourself and the overall package you come in with and how those interviews take place. There was something about online and face-to-face. What is generally sort of the trend? Is it more online or is it face-to-face currently?
I think I answered that question, and I said that it's very much dependent on the role and on the context. So when we have large volumes of applicants, some employers may steer towards remote interviews because they take you can squeeze more in a day essentially. But also depending on the role, if it's a role perhaps in an unusual setting or it's an emerging role, you may want to bring the candidates into the department so you can actually show them around, etc., etc. It may also depend on what sort of digital access the interviewee has and the organization or the employer has. Some of them, because of certain requirements about verifying ID, for example, if they can't do that remotely, they may ask you to come in face to face so they can actually have sight of your ID or your qualifications. So it varies from case to case. But I think in this current climate of lots of applications per role, you're very likely to either have a mixture, a hybrid interview, especially if it's in stages, or a remote interview with all the other paperwork getting done electronically and via email.
Thank you. Shall we move on, Claire?
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks. Next slide, please, Amelia. Excellent. So, like Sarah Jane said at the beginning, I work at the CSP. I'm one of the professional advisors, and I'm based down in South East Coast. And I just want to take the opportunity to walk you through and give you a little bit more information about the support and resources available from the CSP. And just to say that the CSP notes a really challenging time for many final year students and newly qualified physios. At the moment to secure that first role, and supporting you through this is a real key priority at the moment at the CSP. And just to touch on, because a question was asked in the Q&A about the kind of current challenges of getting a first role. And just to say that the CSP is speaking up at a national level, at a governmental level, alongside other professional bodies, really highlighting the need for more opportunities for new physiotherapists. And alongside that, we've really rapidly developed our new graduate support offers as well. So there's a QR code on the bottom of that slide. So anyone who's good at QR codes, I love a QR code now, I've got used to them. I'll get you to have a click on that, and that will take you through to our newly updated graduate support hub. And there you can see there's lots of resources that link in really with a lot of the questions and a lot of the brilliant advice that Pilar and Stephen have been given today. So do have a bit of a look at that. And there's also you can also access, if you're a CSP member, you can also download your handbook for new graduates, which has got loads of brilliant advice around supporting you to secure your first role, but also things to look out for, really key things when you are kind of considering whether to accept your first role or not, such as advice around what to look out for your contract and bits and pieces like that. And a really useful, I think, and we're getting some really brilliant feedback on it, new resource that the CSP has set up this year for new graduates is a graduate support package. And this is it's basically bringing all resources and guidance together in one place, and as well as giving opportunities to develop a community really to support you to take your first steps with confidence into employment. So please do have a bit of a look at that. It has information on it that you can explore for career opportunities, and it's bringing together all of the webinars and the resources that similar to this one that the South East Coast is doing, quite a lot of the other networks and the CSP themselves are doing different webinars to support you. So go and have a look there, along with practical advice as well. And there's also opportunities to stay connected within there, and that's really vital, particularly when you're a new grad. So there's it tells you how you can become part of the professional network, how you can become part of your regional networks, as well as linking in with your either final year students or with your new grad colleagues via the ICSP. And we're also developing opportunities, something that we're calling peer huddles as well. And that's really for new grads who are going through that process of trying to find their first job, to really support them to kind of come together to discuss the challenges and the opportunities, and to share kind of advice and support through that in a way that's monitored by us at the CSP. So really have a good look at that. It's the overarching aim of these new resources is to support you to really feel supported in kind of the challenging landscape it is currently to get your first role. Next slide, please, Amelia. So obviously everyone will feel differently at this stage, and people will have different experiences of trying to find their first role. It can be exciting, it can be daunting, it can give certain levels of uncertainty. So we really wanted to take the opportunity to highlight that this is at this key transition, it's really important that you look after your well-being. And so just wanted to share some ideas and resources and avenues where you might want to seek some support for your well-being. So first I wanted to highlight that your universities, even if you've left and you're a new graduate, universities do extend career and employability services. So do go back and speak to your university if you need help and support. If you are employed in a different role, then lots of employers have their employee assistant programs as well, and they have got things often like confidential helplines, counselling and therapy available to employers. So do explore that. And also at the CSP, through the new grad hub and through other avenues, please stay linked in. You are a really important part of our community whilst you're waiting to get your first role. You can sign up, for example, to our Find a Mentor scheme, and you can sign up as either a mentor, as a or a mentee. Even if you haven't worked as a physiotherapist yet, you'll be a brilliant source of information and support and motivation and inspiration as well for final year students who can also join that. So do stay connected and take the opportunities you can through there. I've popped a QR code as well on the bottom of the screen, so do have a click on that, and that will take you through to the CSP's wellbeing and mental health awareness resources. And that gives you really vital information about how to access support, how to manage stress and anxiety, and also links for useful resources and helplines. But again, do reach out to us at the CSP through our inquiries team if you are struggling. We are here to give you support and guidance, so do reach out to us as an organisation. Pilar, you've raised your hand.
Yes, I saw a question that I think is a bit complex to answer over text, but I think someone asked or commented that they're finding it very demoralizing, having been to multiple interviews from the NHS where they have hundreds of applicants and have interviewed 30 plus candidates for one job. And the question was about any knowledge of when more posts will start coming out, or if there's anything in the plans to help with that situation. So I think, Claire, you've shared what the CSP are doing nationally and also regionally in terms of escalating not only to the government but to NHS as well about the situation with our physio graduates or soon to be graduates. I put on as part of my response that we are super conscious as employers of the number of applicants per post, and it's a really tough decision to decide whether we should limit the number of applications that we accept versus giving as many applicants as possible the opportunity to be considered. And I absolutely hear you to say it could look cruel or it could look demoralizing, whichever decision employers make. Because on one hand, it very much depends on the applicant whether you prefer to know, you know what, I can't even apply for this role because is already close versus I am applying for this role, but I'm competing with 99 other people. What is the point of doing this? Especially, and I absolutely hear you, when you don't even get individual feedback at the point of shortlisting. There's something that Steve touched on earlier about making contact with recruiters. It's such a valuable thing to do and such a lovely way for you to stand out between the hundreds of applicants. When I moved to the UK from Chile, having trained there in 2009, and it was part and parcel of my application process to pick up the phone, send an email and say, I'm interested in this role. Can we have a catch up? Sometimes people can accommodate face to face. Sometimes they can do a 10-minute telephone call or an MS Teams meeting, whatever works, because it gives you the chance to make an impression and to also understand, is this the right job for me? And the other thing I forgot to mention earlier in terms of this is in relation to supporting your well-being, but also being flexible and thinking of possible different outcomes if you're unsuccessful at interviews. Volunteering is a really great way to maintain that contact with the profession. Lots of organizations have really robust processes in place to support you as a volunteer. They can place you in a physio department when you start making some connections, getting some top tips, at least observing what physio practice looks like. And that's something that you can add on your CV and it makes you stand out and makes you competitive. Other ways is thinking of talking to peers and trying to get that, building your support network to make sure that you get to learn from each other, the good and the positive experiences. Also, considering multiple part-time roles. When I started my career, it was a very similar scenario to what we're experiencing now. And I started my first role as an 11-hour job, and then I was doing 3 days a week in an acute trust. And actually, the 11-hour job turned out to be my long life career. But sometimes it's about mixing and matching, and it gives you a really broad perspective working for different organizations, and it allows you to have enough clinical exposure while deciding what your specialism may be in the future.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Pilar. Brilliant advice. Next slide, please. So have a click on that QR code at the bottom. And we'll also pop the link in the chat as well. Just to say that this is a series of webinars to support new graduates with their search their first jobs. So we have our second session tomorrow, and that is on hints and tips for MSK interviews. We have a further session scheduled for managing the acutely unwell respiratory patient on the 3rd of December. So do sign up for those if you can. And we've also got at least 2 more sessions coming across the December and into the new year. One in the planning on neurology and on fragility. So this is really an exciting and evolving webinar series. So do please keep an eye out for that. And then the last slide. We would love to shape these sessions to make them as useful for you as possible. So please do have a click on the QR code or sign on to Menti. And just share with us your thoughts on today, what you would like us to see us doing in the future. And I just want to say a really huge thank you to Stephen and Pilar and all of the South East Coast Regional Network team who've worked so hard to put this together. And hopefully we'll see lots of you back here tomorrow for the next one in the series. Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Amelia.